Hello everybody, this is Ken Witt from the Pixel Posse team, and it's time for another Friday Night Zen. Today's topic is worship. And by worship I mean the traditional meaning of the word, you know, worshipping like a deity or god. So, the first question that I have is, why worship a god? Or gods? Let's talk, mono, polytheistic, all those things. Pantheistic. Question at hand is, why worship a god or gods? As in, what is the purpose behind it? And so, what we can ask first, what we can first denote is try to figure out what are the common reasons that people worship a god. Is it reverence? I find that highly doubtful, because I'm sure if there was no real benefit to worshipping a perceived god, that no one would bother. I certainly wouldn't. But the big question is, why bother? What is the real motivation behind the worship of a god or gods? If it is merely for reward, I find that a bit petty and not a decent reason to bother worshipping. Next question is, why worship any entity, whether god or non-god? What is the whole point? Is it to gain recognition? Is it to pay reverence? Is it perhaps to gain reward? And if that's the case, is that a worthy enough reason to worship? This one's tougher than before. Oh yeah. They're getting progressively harder. Okay. Next question. Is the current mainstream idea of the monotheistic God worthy of worship? What I'm talking about currently is the commonly held Judeo-Christian God. Let's call him Yahweh. Question is he worthy of worship? Well, I think what's more important is what makes one worthy of worship. And does this current idea of God fit the bill? I'd like to say, no, he isn't. What particular reason makes him any worthy? That's because he died for us, if we're gonna go with the Christian point of view? Well, just because someone else sacrifices themselves for me doesn't necessarily make them worthy of worship. Not to mention, is it necessarily a very good thing for you to bother sacrificing yourself for someone else's sins? If someone does something wrong, it's their responsibility to fix it, not someone else's. Next question. Are any of the previous gods imagined worthy of worship? Well, there are many to choose from, so I'm gonna pick my favorite. I'm gonna pick my favorite Greek god, Aphrodite, the goddess of love. She has caused a lot of issues in the past, what with all the Trojan War, and basically being hot and tempting men away from their wives, etc. But I'd like to argue that she is worthy of worship because she does her job well. She's a god of love, and there's certainly no want of that in the realm, if we're gonna think of the way she behaves. So yeah, I would have to argue Aphrodite is one of those few gods. Since there are many gods, since there are many gods, I don't really want to have to go over them all. I'd like to hear I'd definitely like to hear of your opinion, or if there's any gods in particular in the past, or even your favorite god, that may be worthy of worship. So, that's a question. That's a question I'd really like to have an answer to. Next one is, does being the creator of humankind make a higher being worthy of worship? So the whole question here is with if, you know, sort of another way of answering my previous question of what makes a god worthy of worship. And one of the possible answers that I'm expecting would be he created us. And I'd like to argue that just because a being creates us doesn't necessarily make him worth worshipping. And my point there is, if I made a sentient being, I gave it life, does me giving it life justify me demanding it to worship me? I gave the being free will, the power to decide whether or not it wants to, and I demand worship. Or, just because I created something doesn't mean that it should worship me. I'm trying to avoid just merely asserting my opinion here and giving definitive evidence and proof. But the question is what evidence and proof should make a creator worth worshipping? And I like to argue that there isn't any. Just because a creator just because something created us doesn't mean it's worthy of worship. A creator could be evil, diabolical, misogynistic, cruel, but just because it made us doesn't mean I'm gonna bow down to them. So that's one of my points. Next question is, what makes an entity worth worshipping? Now, by entity, I'm going to mean like a higher being, not necessarily a fellow human that we may admire. So, it's essentially, well, what makes a being worth worshipping? I have to say, a being that would be worth worshipping would be a being that we could relate to. Maybe a being that constantly seeks out our evidence. But ultimately, I think my decision and what would make an entity worth worshipping is if they worshipped me as well. I mean, if something worshipped me and had conscience and sentience, I think I would, to the level of that I could comprehend, I would worship it in return. It's only fair. I mean, two beings that admire each other so much that they want to show their admiration through worship to each other. That seems about fair. That only seems right. I can't think of another reason why a being would be worthy of worship. Perhaps if they did great deeds that were worthwhile, but even so, their personality and continued actions would have to be taken into account. Okay, this is... Come on. Come on! You can do it. Okay. Next question. Well, no. So I want to go back to worthy of worship, because... nah, forget it. So, overall, I think a question that wraps up the session would be, is worshipping something or demanding worship ethical? So that's the question. Is demanding worship or worshipping something an ethical thing to do? I'd like to argue that it is. There's nothing unethical about choosing to worship. It's alright to worship something. There's nothing wrong with that. By all means, worship as you see please, as long as it doesn't distract you from what is really worth time. Now, the next question of demanding worship. Is demanding worship ethical? And I say no. Any entity that demands my worship is not worthy of worshipping. Certainly, what makes you think that you are worthy of worship? I would be quicker to worship an entity that asked me not to worship him. Asked me to be, that asked to be humble. An entity that puts me above themselves. That would be an entity that I would say is worth my time. Now the next question, now I'd like to think more about the whole idea of worshipping, say, another human. I don't mean worshipping in the sense of, say, getting on your knees and praying to them. I'm talking more along the subject of just worshipping being the ultimate form of admiration. I'd like to say that that would be worthwhile. That would be fine. If there's somebody or something that I loved so much that I worshipped in that sense, basically the ultimate form of adoration, the ultimate form of self-sacrifice, the ultimate form of, you know, love, I could put it, would be worthwhile. Essentially, I think my conclusion for this discussion would be a deity may not necessarily be worthy of worship unless it proves itself, just as another human being may not be worthy of worship in the sense of ultimate love, unless, you know, you truly love them. But in the sense of worshipping a deity, it matters more about what the deity does or what it promises, and not so much what you get out of the relationship. I don't think that would be a worthy enough reason for worship. And when it comes to worshipping a human being in the sense of love, it need be selfless, it doesn't need to be returned, and that's all that makes it worthwhile. Now today's quote is from a decently renowned Christian theologian, Joyce O'Neill. And his quote is, "Imitation is the greatest form of flattery, and worship is the greatest form of adoration." I'd have to say that I agree with Mr. Joyce O'Neill in that sense. Though I have read some of his other work, and I don't really agree with much of that, but that's not important. So, that's what I'd like everyone to think about today. Yeah, so there you have it. Worship. And my thoughts. I'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts. So please, reply, leave a comment, suggest my next topic, or just outright disagree and berate me. I like criticism, good or bad. Trust me, I enjoy when people make fun of my ideas. It helps me grow. So, have a nice day, everyone. Oy, oy, oy. It's been Ken Witt from the Pixel Posse team. Enjoy your Friday night Zen.